Night is descending over the Nile, and the great river moves with a slow, unhurried confidence, its dark surface catching the last traces of copper and violet light as the sun sinks beyond the western desert. The air cools where golden sands give way to narrow bands of fertile black soil, and a hush settles in, broken only by the soft lap of water against worn stone and the faint whisper of reeds swaying at the river's edge. Above, one by one, stars begin to appear over the shadowed silhouettes of pylons and columns, over the clean, sharp lines of distant pyramids, until the sky itself feels like an immense temple roof scattered with luminous hieroglyphs. In this quiet, as we embark on this exploration, Egyptian mythology rises around us like the river mist, at once familiar in its themes and utterly strange in its images. This was not a brief fashion of belief, but a living reality that endured across 3 millennia, flowing through changing dynasties, shifting capitals, and evolving rituals, much as the Nile itself wound through the length of the civilization. Names of gods altered, temples rose and fell, new hymns were composed, and old spells recopied. Yet what remained constant was the sense that the universe, like the river, moved in endless cycles of flooding and retreat, death and renewed creation. When we speak of this mythology, we are not merely recounting old stories of falcon-headed gods and jackal guardians. We are entering a complete way of seeing the cosmos, a complex tapestry of narratives and symbols that addressed fundamental human concerns about order and chaos, mortality and the afterlife, justice and meaning. Here, creation was not a single distant event, but a pattern repeating in temple ritual, in the rising sun, in the growth of grain from the dark, wet earth. The Egyptians imagined that every dawn echoed the first sunrise, every successful harvest reenacted the first emergence of land from the deep, and every carefully prepared tomb participated in the original victory of life over death. As you listen, you do not need to hold every name or lineage firmly in your memory. Instead, we will move at a calm, measured pace, allowing images and ideas to unfold like the slow turning of a papyrus scroll. You may drift in and out of attention, letting the symbolism wash over you the way moonlight ripples across the river, a solar bark gliding through the night sky, a green-skinned king seated in judgment, a feather of truth balancing a human heart. The purpose here is not to test recall, but to invite a deep, restful familiarity with a world that continues to captivate us. For before there were temples on the riverbank, before there were fields or pyramids, or even the first mound of earth, the Egyptians envisioned only an endless silent ocean of darkness, a boundless expanse of primordial water without shore or star. In our next step, we will drift with them into that stillness and watch as the very first light struggles into being. From that silent ocean of darkness, before the first glimmer of Egyptian creation has yet appeared, we can pause for a moment and ask why this ancient imagination, born beside the Nile, continues to captivate us across such a vast distance of time. Along the life-giving banks of that river, where golden sands met fertile black soil, a religious tradition unfolded across 3 millennia, surviving changing dynasties, droughts, invasions, and foreign rulers, until it became one of humanity's deepest narrative roots, a continuous thread of mythology woven through the entire history of this civilization. Empires rose and fell, languages shifted, and new powers arrived from Nubia, Assyria, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Yet what remained constant was a shared symbolic world. Ra still sailed the sky, Osiris still ruled the afterlife, Ma'at still embodied truth and cosmic order, and the pharaoh, whether Egyptian or foreign, was still expected to step into the role of divine king. This extraordinary continuity means that when we touch Egyptian beliefs, we are not merely visiting a brief historical moment, but entering a long, slow river of thought that carried countless generations from birth to death. Even if we have never opened a book on Egyptian mythology, its shapes already feel familiar. We see the all-seeing eye of Horus on jewelry and tattoos, the Ankh of life on necklaces and in fashion, the jackal-headed Anubis on film posters, or sleek golden sarcophagi in museum halls, their painted eyes following us with a calm, unblinking gaze. Popular novels send archaeologists into cursed tombs, video games invite us to wander through reconstructed temples, and animated suns rise over pyramids in opening scenes, so that the symbols drift quietly into our imagination until they seem like old acquaintances rather than strangers from an ancient world. Yet the reason this complex tapestry endures is not only visual. At its heart, Egyptian mythology speaks to fundamental human concerns that we too may ponder in the stillness before sleep. How anything could arise from chaos at all, whether the fragile order of our days can hold against disaster, what it means that every life ends, and whether some form of renewal waits beyond that ending. When the Egyptians pictured the first mound rising from the waters of Nun, or Ra growing old each evening and being reborn at dawn, they were meditating on the oscillation between loss and restoration that shapes our own lives. For them, these were not stories told merely for entertainment, they were living reality, patterns by which temple ritual, royal authority, and private grief were aligned with the wider cosmos. To recite a hymn, to bury a loved one with a Book of the Dead spell, to carve a scene of the weighing of the heart on a tomb wall, was to participate in a cosmic drama in which human choices either upheld or disturbed Ma'at. As we embark on this exploration, to listen quietly to these myths is to let our own thoughts brush against that vast pattern. In the chapters ahead, we will drift back into the first night and watch the sun god emerge from the primordial waters, follow gods who age and are renewed, and accompany the soul through the duat toward Osiris's judgment as the heart trembles on the scales beside the feather of Ma'at. For now, we rest on the edge of that dark ocean, knowing that the next step in our journey will carry us into the very first moment of light. From that imagined glimmer of light, we gently widen our view, because Egyptian mythology did not float in a timeless void. It grew alongside a very real civilization stretching along the Nile. As we embark on this exploration of stories and gods, it helps to rest for a moment in the slow rhythm of history, so that when a name or a temple appears later, you can feel roughly where you are in the long river of Egyptian time. Long before pyramids or pharaohs, small communities gathered on the riverbanks in what we call the pre-dynastic period, experimenting with agriculture, pottery, and the first hints of sacred symbolism. Gradually, these villages thickened into regional chiefdoms until, around the dawn of history, the lands we now call Upper and Lower Egypt were drawn together under a single ruler. This unification, remembered in crowns and ceremonial palettes, created the stage on which the myths of divine kingship, of Horus and the two lands, would become a living reality. From there, the broad sweep of Egyptian history unfolds in great tidal phases. The Old Kingdom, age of the pyramid builders, saw the first extensive religious inscriptions carved inside royal tombs, the pyramid texts. These spells and hymns already presuppose rich myths of cosmic creation, of Ra's solar journey, and of the king ascending to the sky. Yet they speak as if these truths are ancient, not newly invented. Later, in the Middle Kingdom, power shifted and refined itself, and the coffin texts appeared on the wooden coffins of nobles and officials, opening the afterlife to a wider circle, while the New Kingdom, with its vast temples at Thebes and beyond, expanded the pantheon's splendor across 3 millennia of cultural memory. When we read these different layers of text, we are not seeing separate mythologies, but a complex tapestry in motion. The stories themselves are older than any inscription, carried in oral recitation, temple ritual, and festival drama, reshaped as dynasties rose and fell. What remained constant was the concern for cosmic order, for Ma'at, even as emphasis shifted. The sun god Ra might stand foremost in one age, while in another, Amun of Thebes rose to preeminence, merging into Amun-Ra as theology and politics intertwined. Across the centuries, Egypt did not remain isolated. Libyan chieftains, Nubian kings, Assyrian and Persian emperors, and finally Greek and Roman rulers took the throne, each required to clothe themselves in Egyptian forms, to present themselves as proper pharaohs upholding Ma'at. Greek visitors like Herodotus wandered among temples whose rituals were already very old, listening to priests recount creation and afterlife beliefs, and they carried these tales home, filtering them through their own philosophies, comparing Thoth to Hermes, Isis to Demeter, layering outside interpretations onto native traditions in ways that still shape how Egyptian religion continues to captivate us. Then, slowly, the voices on the stone walls fell silent. As Christianity spread and the old temples closed, the knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs faded, until the carved prayers and myths became mute decoration, their profound wisdom locked away. For more than 1,000 years, no one could truly hear Ra's hymns or follow Osiris through the duat. How then did we learn to listen again, and what fragments of the god's own stories still lie hidden in the ruins, waiting to be recovered as we move into the heart of the myths themselves? To hear the gods again, we have to return first to the land that shaped them, to the slow pulse of water and light that made Egyptian mythology a living reality rather than an abstract system of beliefs. Along the life-giving banks of the Nile, where golden sands meet fertile black soil, the stage was set for a complex tapestry of stories about order and chaos, death and renewal that continues to captivate us across 3 millennia. Each year, the Nile rose in a measured, almost ceremonial flood, creeping over its banks, swallowing fields and paths, then withdrawing and leaving behind a dark, glittering skin of silt. What might have been a disaster became instead a predictable miracle, turning desert into grain and papyrus, date palms and lotus pools. This quiet cycle of submergence and return, of disappearance and rebirth, echoed in the mythology of Osiris, the god whose dismembered body was gathered, reassembled and revivified, and whose green skin and burial in the earth made every harvest feel like a small resurrection, a promise that the afterlife could mirror the river's dependable generosity. Yet, if we stepped only a short distance from that narrow green ribbon, the world changed. On one side lay the ordered valley, measured in fields, canals, and villages, where human labor and divine favor together upheld Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and right order. On the other side stretched the desert, trackless, blinding, haunted by scorpions, sandstorms, and hostile tribes. Here, Egyptian imagination placed Seth, the unsettling god of storms and violence, whose domain represented not simple evil, but the ever-present possibility that order might fray. The cultivated land and the surrounding wastes formed a vast contrastive pair, a daily reminder that civilization itself was a fragile island of Ma'at amid cosmic uncertainty. Above this landscape, the blazing sun traced its unhurried arc, a visible emblem of divine kingship and endurance. By day, Ra sailed in his shining bark across the sky, triumphant and radiant. By night, he vanished into the hidden Duat, where, as we embark on this exploration of his journey, we find him aged, vulnerable, beset by the serpent Apophis and other forces of dissolution, yet always emerging renewed at dawn. Sunrise and sunset were not merely times of day, but rituals of creation repeated endlessly, affirming that even the greatest of the gods must struggle to preserve order. When night fell clear and dry, the sky itself became another river. The Milky Way could be imagined as a heavenly Nile flowing above the earthly one, with constellations as islands and temples, and the goddess Nut arching overhead, her star-studded body swallowing the sun at dusk and giving birth to it each morning. The Egyptians mapped their geography upward, seeing in the stars a celestial counterpart to their own fields and villages, so that the afterlife might feel both wondrous and familiar. And so, in flood and drought, in sunrise and sunset, in the green valley and the red desert, we already glimpse the patterns that will guide the stories to come. What remained constant was this soothing, cyclical rhythm, in which even betrayal, death, and judgment would be framed not as final endings, but as movements within a greater cosmic tide that we are now ready to follow into the heart of the myths themselves. And yet, before we can follow that greater cosmic tide into the dramas of the gods themselves, we need to pause for a moment beside the sources from which those tides reach us, the quiet stones and fragile papyri that preserve this mythology. Along the life-giving banks of the Nile, priests and scribes once whispered sacred words in darkened chambers, and what they carved or inked for the dead has become our doorway into the Egyptian imagination. The oldest of these doorways are the pyramid texts, cut deep into the inner walls of royal tombs in the Old Kingdom, invisible from the outside world, meant not for human eyes, but for the king's eternal journey. Here, in cramped corridors beneath massive stone, we find spells that help the dead pharaoh ascend to the sky, join the circumpolar stars, and sit among the gods, along with hymns to Ra and Osiris, and brief allusions to stories that must already have been ancient. We do not read a continuous tale, but a mosaic of invocations, cosmic images, and ritual instructions. As Egyptian civilization changed, this sacred technology of words slowly opened beyond the king. The coffin texts, painted on wooden coffins in the Middle Kingdom, carry many of the same spells, now adapted for non-royal officials and their families, guiding them through the Duat, the shadowed landscape of the afterlife.
Later still, in the New Kingdom and beyond, the so-called Book of the Dead appears on rolls of papyrus and on tomb walls, a complex tapestry of formulas, passwords, and vivid scenes that show the heart weighed against the feather of Maat, ferries crossing perilous waters, and the blessed dead joining Osiris. What began as the privilege of a single body beneath a pyramid becomes, across 3 millennia, a more democratized path toward eternity. Yet even here we must be careful. There was never a single official Bible of Egyptian myth, no fixed canon that defined once and for all how the cosmos was created or how every god behaved. Instead, myths are scattered like shards of pottery, in temple reliefs and hymns, in ritual papyri used for festivals, in magical handbooks, in literary tales copied for education. The same event, such as the murder of Osiris or the nightly voyage of Ra, might be told in different ways in different cities because mythology was a living reality, reshaped by local cults, political needs, and evolving theological reflection. Yet many of the narratives we will soon encounter reach us only in damaged, incomplete form, their edges frayed by time. The contendings of Horus and Seth, with its long divine court case and moments of startling humor, survives in a handful of manuscripts, some broken just where we long for clarity. The Book of the Heavenly Cow, which explains a cosmic rebellion against Ra and the separation of sky and earth, is known from partial copies on tomb walls and papyri, each preserving and omitting different lines. Scholars patiently compare versions, reconstruct missing passages, and trace echoes across genres, piecing together stories that once flowed effortlessly in priestly memory. As we embark on this exploration of Egyptian mythology, it is worth remembering that much of what we know comes from tombs and funerary rites, from texts designed above all to secure safe passage after death. Imagine yourself lying on a stone bench within such a chamber, the air cool and still, the ceiling painted deep blue and sprinkled with golden stars, while around you march columns of hieroglyphs and images, boats sailing the night sky, serpents bound by spells, goddesses stretching protectively over the sarcophagus. You close your eyes beneath that starry vault, and the walls promise that the heart will be light, the path clear, the judgment favorable. Yet beneath their practical assurances, beneath each spell and scene, there glimmers a more elusive, profound wisdom about creation, order, and the fundamental human concerns of fear, hope, and meaning. What deeper patterns of thought lie hidden in those constellations of signs is what continues to captivate us, and what we now follow, step by careful step, into the myths themselves.
To follow these hidden patterns, we first need to understand that the Egyptian gods themselves were not rigid characters in a closed storybook, but shifting radiant powers in a living reality, whose names, forms, and relationships could bend and flow like the Nile in flood. Where we might expect strict consistency, we instead find a complex tapestry of overlapping identities, composite beings, and parallel tales that, rather than contradicting one another, were allowed to stand side by side in a quiet, contemplative harmony. Across 3 millennia of Egyptian civilization, deities rose and faded, yet what remained constant was the sense that each god expressed a facet of a larger, ineffable order. The sun god Ra could appear as a falcon, a scarab beetle, and old man, or merge with others to become Ra Horakti, the horizon falcon, or Amun-Ra,
the hidden power behind the visible disk. These were not replacements, but fusions, theological reflections of political and cultural unions, as priesthoods and cities wove their local beliefs into the wider fabric of the state. Different cities, each with its own sacred landscape and priestly schools, promoted their own creator gods and their own visions of creation. In Heliopolis, Atum rose from the dark waters of Nun upon the first mound, generating the Ennead of Shu, Tefnut, Geb, Nut, and their descendants. In Memphis, the craftsman's god Ptah brought the cosmos into being through thought and speech, shaping reality as an artisan shapes stone. Elsewhere, in Hermonopolis, an Ogdoad of primeval forces stirred the cosmic egg. These myths did not cancel one another out, they coexisted as multiple windows onto the same mysterious beginning. The pantheon was also open to the wider world. As Egypt traded and sometimes fought with Syria, Nubia, and other neighboring lands, foreign deities could be welcomed, translated into Egyptian forms, and settled into temples beside older gods. A Syrian storm god might be identified with Set, a Nubian lion goddess with Sekhmet or Hathor, their names and attributes gently adjusted through ritual and symbolism. In this way, the mythology continues to captivate us as an example of religious imagination that could absorb new powers without losing its center. That center was Maat. More than a goddess with a feather on her head, Maat was the very principle of rightness, truth, justice, balance, and the proper ordering of the cosmic and human worlds. Pharaohs offered small images of Maat to the gods in ritual scenes, signifying that even the king ruled only by sustaining this delicate equilibrium. Opposed to Maat was Isfet, chaos, falsehood, and violent unmaking, forever threatening to drag creation back toward the dark waters of Nun. As we embark on this exploration of the great narrative cycles, the birth of the world, the murder and restoration of Osiris, the daily and nightly journeys of the sun, we will see this interplay of change and continuity recur like variations on a theme. Different temples will tell the story in different ways. New gods will step forward or merge with old ones. Yet beneath every shifting name and image, Maat will remain the quiet, steady pulse of Egyptian mythology and its profound wisdom about order, time, and the possibility of renewal.
And so, as Maat remains that quiet, steady pulse beneath every shifting name and image, we can turn from abstract principle to the very concrete machinery that tried to embody it in stone and ceremony. Along the life-giving banks of the Nile, palaces and pylons did not simply rise as human architecture, they stood as extensions of heaven, as if the cosmic drama had grown foundations and doorways. At the center of this arrangement stood the pharaoh, not merely as a political ruler, but as the living Horus, the falcon god manifested in human form. In life, he was Horus triumphant, the rightful heir who had once defeated Set and secured the throne of the gods, and every coronation quietly reenacted that victory, affirming that chaos had been pushed back yet again. In death, however, the same king became an Osiris, entering the underworld as the resurrected lord of the afterlife, so that the royal line itself formed a cycle of death and rebirth, Horus following Osiris, son following father, each accession a renewed promise that the sun would rise and the Nile would flow.
Temples in this system were not built as gathering places for congregations, and ordinary Egyptians did not file in for weekly sermons. Instead, they functioned as sealed cosmic engines, where the gods were believed to dwell in their most concentrated presence. Deep within, in the innermost sanctuary, a small statue of the deity rested in a shrine, and each dawn the priests performed a precise sequence of ritual acts, awakening the god with hymns, opening the doors of the naos, anointing, clothing, and feeding the image with bread, beer, and incense, so that creation itself would be refreshed. The god's statue was washed, as the world had once been washed clean by the primordial waters. It was dressed, as the sky was dressed in light. On festival days, these hidden powers emerged. Processions carried the divine statues out on gilded barks, swaying on the shoulders of priests, or gliding on actual boats along the river, so that the god could visit neighboring temples, reunite with a consort, or inspect the fields. Some celebrations staged symbolic battles against chaos, echoing the nightly struggle of Ra against the serpent Apophis, while others welcomed and praised the Nile flood, reading its generous waters as a visible sign that the gods approved of the reigning pharaoh and his maintenance of order. Mythology in these moments became a living reality, unfolding not in distant time, but in the streets and canals of the kingdom. Legal decisions and social hierarchies, too, were framed in the language of Maat. Judges wore small images of the goddess. Officials boasted in inscriptions that they did Maat and drove out Isfet, and the pharaoh was praised as the one who gave bread to the hungry and protected the weak, just as the gods were said to uphold balance in heaven. Across 3 millennia, governments rose and fell, capitals shifted, foreign dynasties took the throne, yet what remained constant was this claim that to obey the king and the laws was, at least in theory, to cooperate with the very structure of the cosmos. Yet for most people, these grand institutions were distant, glimpsed only in the shimmer of a passing procession or the outline of a temple against the evening sky. Their contact with the divine took quieter forms, a small clay bess or taweret set in a corner of the house, an Eye of Horus amulet tied around a child's neck, a whispered prayer to Isis or Osiris before sleep. As we embark on this exploration of Egyptian mythology at the state level, we should remember that beneath the polished theology of kings and priests, countless private hopes and fears flowed like underground water. Egyptian mythology continues to captivate us, not only because of its monumental temples and royal tombs, but because it bound together palace and cottage, sun temple and bedside charm, all under the gaze of the same patient gods. Yet even this intricate machinery of temples, festivals, and royal ideology was only one layer of the story. For behind the public rituals lay older, deeper narratives about how the gods themselves first gained their power, how kingship was won in the heavens before it was ever worn on earth, and how the patterns of divine conflict and reconciliation set the template for every human reign that followed.
Yet Egyptian religion was never only about kings, temple walls, and the distant horizon of the afterlife. It was also a living reality of small gestures, quiet fears, and whispered names of the gods in the half-light of ordinary homes. Along the same Nile that carried the barks of state cults, families woke and slept beneath modest roofs where mythology met the most fundamental human concerns. In many houses, a simple niche in a wall, a ledge above a doorway, or a small wooden stand became a household shrine, a tiny echo of the great sanctuaries whose doors most people would never enter. Here, a painted plaque or a roughly carved figurine might receive a morsel of bread, a sip of beer, a wisp of incense smoke at dawn and at dusk, as we embark on this exploration of religion, not from the perspective of priests and pharaohs, but from the vantage point of the weaver, the farmer, the midwife, and the child. A few spoken words, barely more than a murmur, could invite protection for the coming day or gratitude for one safely past. Among the most beloved of these domestic gods was Bes, the dwarf-like guardian whose leonine mane, protruding tongue, and exaggerated features were meant to frighten away what lurked in the dark. His image danced on bedposts, cosmetic jars, and amulets, watching over sleep, music, and revelry, but most of all childbirth, when life and death stood perilously close. Bes stood beside Taweret, the pregnant hippopotamus goddess with crocodile back and lion's paws, whose rounded belly and heavy form were powerful symbolism of fertility and endurance. For Egyptian women, these were not abstract deities of cosmic order, but immediate allies in the blood, pain, and hope of bringing new life into the world. Beyond the threshold of the house, village and city festivals allowed ordinary people to step briefly into the grander currents of mythology that continues to captivate us. When the Nile's inundation rose, celebrations marked the renewal of creation itself, as if Nun's primordial waters were returning in a controlled, beneficent form. Processions of divine statues, veiled in gilded shrines and carried on the shoulders of priests, moved through crowded streets during feasts of Hathor or the return of a distant goddess to her temple, giving even the poorest onlooker a fleeting glimpse of the gods as they emerged from darkness into the sun. Daily anxieties, however, remained close at hand. Illness that could not be explained, the sudden bite of a snake or sting of a scorpion, a difficult birth, a child's fever, a string of bad dreams that seemed to fray the boundary between worlds. In such moments, people turned to amulets inscribed with the eye of Horus, to small scarabs bearing protective names, to bowls and ostraka inked with simple spells. These charms often invoked mythic precedents, recalling how Isis cured Ra's poison, how Horus was healed after being struck, how Sekhmet's raging fire was cooled, weaving a complex tapestry in which past divine actions authorized present human hopes. Across 3 millennia, what remained constant was the intuition that every remedy, every incantation, and every humble offering participated in stories far older than any single household. Behind each blue faience figure, each protective formula recited over water or oil, lay longer narratives of gods who had themselves suffered wounds, endured venom, faced dismemberment and decay, and yet emerged renewed. Egyptian mythology did not separate magic from medicine or narrative from practice. Instead, it suggested that healing flowed from aligning oneself with the remembered victories of the gods. And so, from these quiet rooms and crowded festivals alike, we are drawn onward toward those deeper tales of creation, conflict, death, and restoration, where the powers behind every amulet and whispered charm first came into being.
From those quiet rooms and crowded festival courtyards where incense drifted and low voices repeated remembered phrases, we move more deliberately into the force that made such practices possible, a power the Egyptians called Heka. Along the life-giving banks of the Nile, where golden sands met fertile black soil, Heka was not dismissed as superstition, but honored as a fundamental cosmic energy, given by the Creator at the moment of creation, so that both gods and humans might shape reality through word, gesture, and carefully ordered ritual. Egyptian mythology tells us that even before the first mound rose from the dark waters of Nun, Heka already existed as a principle in the mind of the Creator, a kind of invisible current allowing thought to become speech and speech to become event. When Ptah, in the theology of Memphis, brings the world into being through heart and tongue, or when Ra names the gods and they spring forth, we are witnessing Heka as a living reality, the same force that later healers would invoke over a cup of water, an oil, or a bandage laid gently on the skin. As we embark on this exploration of Egyptian healing, we find that many spells do not simply command an illness to depart. Instead, they retell a myth. A child with a fever might be addressed as Horus in the marshes, struck down by a scorpion's sting, while the words spoken over him recall Isis bending over her son, reciting divine names until his breath returns. A man bitten by a snake becomes, in the language of the spell, the sun god Ra himself, ambushed by hidden venom, so that by narrating the ancient crisis and its resolution, the present suffering is drawn into the mythic pattern of defeat, followed by restoration. In these texts, the healer does not always speak as an ordinary human observer. The practitioner may suddenly adopt the voice of Isis, or Thoth, or even the Creator, declaring, "I am Isis, I have driven out the poison," or "I am Thoth, I have set in order what was disordered," so that their own fragile authority is replaced by the unassailable authority of the gods. The patient, in turn, is addressed as Horus, as Ra, as Osiris restored after dismemberment, and the victory over illness or venom enacted in divine time is meant to repeat itself here and now across 3 millennia of recitation and trust. A small amulet might complete this alignment, the Eye of Horus or Wedjat, worn on a cord or painted on a vessel, condensed into a single image the story of Horus's wounded and restored eye, standing for protection, wholeness, and the re-establishment of order after violence. The scarab beetle rolling its ball of dung across the ground became a symbol of the sun's daily rebirth, and so of renewed life pressed against the chest of the living or sewn into the wrappings of the dead, its modest form carrying vast layers of symbolism and profound wisdom. Yet beneath the immediate hope of easing pain, cooling fever, or calming fear, there was a quieter philosophy at work. Egyptian mythology continues to captivate us here because it suggests that human lives can be folded into divine stories, that by speaking and wearing and remembering we may align ourselves with patterns older than the stars. What remained constant was the conviction that stories themselves could heal, that to move from chaos back into order was to participate in the same drama enacted by Ra at dawn and Osiris in the afterlife, a conviction that will guide us as we turn next to those grand tales of creation and cosmic struggle from which every spell ultimately drew its power.
Yet underneath those grand tales of creation and cosmic struggle, Egyptian thinkers were not only telling stories,
They were quietly asking what the divine itself might be. In temple libraries, in shadowed sanctuaries thick with incense, priests and theologians reflected on whether all these many gods were, in some sense, faces of a single hidden reality, a mystery too vast to be contained in one name or one image, yet gracious enough to appear in many. Across 3 millennia of Egyptian civilization, the language and symbolism changed, cult centers rose and fell, but what remained constant was a sense that the divine was both one and many at once. A hymn from Thebes might praise Amun as the hidden one, unseen yet present in every other god, while a Memphis text speaks of Ptah conceiving the world in his heart and bringing it forth with his tongue, so that every deity is an utterance of one creative mind. The mythology we are about to enter is therefore not a chaotic crowd of competing gods, but a complex tapestry of interwoven manifestations. This is why the same divine power could appear in so many different forms. The falcon-headed Horus, sharp-eyed and soaring above the Nile, expresses royal clarity and far-seeing protection. The lioness-headed Sekhmet, blazing with solar fire, embodies destructive heat and healing power in the same terrible gaze. Thoth may be shown as an ibis, a baboon, or a dignified scribe, each form emphasizing a different aspect of wisdom and speech. For the Egyptian imagination, these were not contradictions, but facets of a living reality, ways of hinting that the sacred overflowed any single shape. So as we embark on this exploration of primordial waters, divine conflicts, and journeys through the underworld, we can let each scene work on us in more than one way. You may hear of the silent ocean of Nun and imagine the birth of the universe, yet also feel the stillness before your own thoughts arise. You may follow Ra through the Duat and sense both the sun's nightly path and the soul's passage through fear toward renewal. As you drift deeper into the story, each god, each trial, each radiant dawn can be heard both as a narrative and as a meditation on existence itself, guiding you gently toward the next unfolding chapter of Egyptian mythology.
And so, as those images of Ra's nightly voyage and the soul's quiet passage begin to settle in your mind, we arrive at a threshold, a gentle boundary between the world we inhabit by day and the story world we are about to enter together by night. Along this edge, where your breathing slows and your body grows heavier, we can feel 2 different ways of understanding reality resting side by side. In our modern experience, shaped by science, individualism, and clocks that divide time into neat, unyielding segments, the universe often appears as a closed system of matter and energy, governed by impersonal laws, unfolding along a single, linear path from past to future. The self feels enclosed within the skin, the dead feel gone in a definitive way, and the stars above are distant spheres of burning gas. Yet for the Egyptian imagination, the cosmos was a complex tapestry of interwoven realms, a living reality in which gods, humans, and the dead moved across permeable boundaries, touching one another through dream, ritual, and symbol. Temples, tombs, and the open desert were not merely locations in space, they were junctions between layers of existence, where the Nile's flood echoed the first surge of creation, and the daily sunrise reenacted the victory of order over chaos. Time itself did not simply march forward, it circled back on itself as Ra aged each evening, journeyed through the duat, and was renewed at dawn, while Osiris died and rose again in the grain and in the justified dead. As we embark on this exploration, we are invited to loosen our grip on strictly linear time and allow cyclical rhythms to guide us. Our path through Egyptian mythology will unfold not as a list of facts to memorize, but as a series of gentle voyages through recurring cycles. We will drift first through the creation stories, where from the dark waters of Nun a first mound rises, and a solitary god, Atum or Ra, emerges. Then we will follow the Osiris story, with its betrayal, dismemberment, and profound wisdom about renewal. We will trace the solar journey, the sunboat gliding across the sky by day and threading the underworld by night. And finally, we will accompany the soul after death through the duat to the weighing of the heart and the promise of eternal life with Osiris. The purpose is not that you recall every name in the Ennead or distinguish every local variation of a myth, but that you begin to feel the patterns moving beneath them like slow currents under the Nile's surface, order emerging from formlessness, death bending toward rebirth, conflict resolving into balance. These motifs repeat across 3 millennia of Egyptian history. Beliefs changed, gods merged and separated, rituals shifted, yet what remained constant was this trust that chaos could be shaped, that endings could become beginnings, that justice and harmony, Ma'at, could be restored. As your muscles soften and your thoughts grow lighter, you do not need to follow every detail. You can let the stories wash over you as a kind of guided dream, knowing that even if you drift in and out of sleep, the river of myth will carry you. You may imagine yourself reclining in a cool, lamp-lit chamber, walls painted with stars and sailing boats, while a priest storyteller speaks softly, his words weaving a bridge between this world and another. Whether you listen closely or only half hear phrases and images, the symbolism can work quietly within you, addressing fundamental human concerns about origin, loss, fear, and renewal. Now we stand before the first narrative door. Before there were falcon-headed kings, before the green-skinned lord of the afterlife, before crowns and scepters and carefully ordered temples, there was only an endless, motionless darkness. No sky, no earth, no gods, no living thing. Only water without shore, the primordial Nun stretching in all directions. In that vast, silent expanse, something begins to stir, almost imperceptibly, as if the cosmos itself is drawing its first breath and preparing to raise from the depths a single glistening mound of earth and the very first spark of creation.
Out of that endless, motionless darkness, the first disturbance is not a thunderclap or a violent rupture, but a quiet, almost hesitant emergence, as if the universe is learning how to exist. The Egyptians imagined that before any god, before any sky or earth, there was only Nun, the primordial waters, a limitless ocean of black, silent potential in which nothing yet had taken shape, yet everything that could ever be was already possible. No horizon, no stars, only depth without direction.
In this vast, formless expanse, a single point of stability begins to rise, like a memory surfacing from deep sleep. They described it as the first mound of earth, a small hill pushing up through the waters of Nun, glistening and new, the first dry land in a world of flood. Sometimes this first emergence was imagined as a lotus bud, swelling and opening on the surface of the dark waters, its petals holding the promise of light. Sometimes it was a simple rise of earth, a hillock such as one might see appear along the Nile as the inundation receded and the fertile soil of the floodplain returned. Along the river, this was a familiar rhythm. Water covers everything, then slowly withdraws, revealing islands of land where life can take root. Egyptian mythology transformed that yearly experience into a cosmic drama of creation. What the farmer saw after the flood, the theologian saw at the beginning of time. The first mound was not only a piece of ground, it was the first instance of order, a place where something could stand, where a god could appear, where the story could begin. Upon that mound in the Heliopolis tradition, the first god brings himself into being. He is Atum, sometimes already fused with the sun as Ra, sometimes a potentiality who will later blaze forth as the solar disk. He is self-created, arising from Nun without parents, a solitary consciousness awakening in the dark. Texts describe him fashioning the next generation of gods through acts that are at once physical and symbolic. He breathes, he speaks, he emits, and from his word, his breath, his body, Shu the air and Tefnut the moisture come forth, the first pair in a line that will structure the cosmos. As we embark on this exploration of Egyptian creation, it is helpful to notice how this moment mirrors our own most intimate daily transition. Each morning we rise from the indistinct waters of sleep, when thoughts are fluid and boundaries soft, into the solid ground of waking awareness, where names, places, and duties return. The Egyptians saw the sun itself perform this gesture, lifting out of the horizon as if from Nun, and so creation was not a single event locked in the past, but a living reality renewed with every dawn. Across 3 millennia of Egyptian civilization, details of the story changed, yet what remained constant was this movement from formless water to stable land, from silence to speech, from solitude to relationship. From Atum on his mound will come Shu and Tefnut, then Geb the earth, and Nut the sky, and in time Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys, the divine family whose joys and conflicts will give shape to the world of the living and the afterlife alike. Already within this quiet first emergence from Nun, the entire complex tapestry of Egyptian mythology is contained in seed form, waiting to unfold. As the first light gathers around Atum Ra on his lonely hill, we stand with him at the threshold of differentiation, about to watch air separate from water, earth from sky, and the great Ennead of Heliopolis step forward to organize the cosmos and to speak to those fundamental human concerns that continue to captivate us.
From that first glimmer of light on the primeval mound, the Egyptian mythology of Heliopolis begins to unfold not as a single act of creation, but as a family story, a complex tapestry of relationships that gradually builds a cosmos. As we stay with Atum Ra on his lonely hill, the next movement in this quiet drama is not thunder or battle. but the emergence of two almost invisible presences, Shu and Tefnut. Shu is air, the clear, weightless space in which breath can move and sound can travel, the unseen interval between things. Tefnut is moisture, the coolness of mist before dawn, the damp that allows seeds to swell and clouds to gather. Generated by Atum, they are described in some texts as issuing from him like breath and spittle, subtle forces that both separate and connect, stretching a first fragile distance between what is above and what is below, yet binding them together through the continuous circulation of wind and vapor. Already, creation is not an object, but a living reality of relations. From this pair of air and moisture come two more tangible beings, Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. Egyptian artists show Geb as a reclining man, his body ridged like cultivated fields and desert hills, while above him arches Nut, a woman whose star-studded form curves from horizon to horizon. Between them stands Shu, arms upraised, holding them apart. Without this poised, almost strenuous gesture, earth and sky would collapse back into each other, and the world of open space in which life can unfold would vanish. Here the theology becomes quietly architectural. The Egyptians are not merely saying that there is land below and sky above. They are depicting the very stability of the cosmos as an ongoing act, a kind of eternal ritual of separation. Shu's lifted hands are the reason there is room for the Nile to flow, for temples to be built, for human breath to continue. If we imagine that separation failing for even a moment, we glimpse the ever-present possibility of uncreation, when Nun's waters might reclaim everything. From the union of Geb and Nut, while they are still yearning toward one another across Shu's upheld arms, come 4 children whose stories will dominate much of Egyptian religion: Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. They are not just another divine generation. They are the point where this cosmic genealogy begins to speak directly to fundamental human concerns. Osiris will embody ideal kingship and the mystery of death. Isis will become the model of devoted spouse and powerful magician. Seth will personify violence, desert winds, and necessary but dangerous disruption. Nephthys will hover at the margins, guardian of thresholds and of the dead. At this point, we might expect the narrative to abandon the elements and move entirely into drama, yet what remained constant was the underlying cosmology. Air, moisture, earth, and sky remain as parents and grandparents, reminding us that the physical environment of the Egyptian civilization was imagined as a family of beings rather than inert matter. The river's haze is Tefnut's breath. The breeze at dusk is Shu's caress. The ground beneath one's feet is the body of Geb, and the glittering vault above is Nut swallowing the sun at dusk and birthing it again at dawn. As we embark on this exploration of the Ennead, we should keep in view that this Heliopolitan story was only one of several creation accounts circulating across 3 millennia of Egyptian history. Other cities spoke of cosmic eggs, of an octoad of primeval gods, or of Ptah shaping the world through thought and speech, yet all agreed on a central insight. The world exists because different forces have been delicately separated and balanced, and that balance must be maintained through right ritual and right living. In the next movement of our journey, when Osiris falls and Isis weaves him back toward life, we will see how easily that balance can be disturbed, and how passionately the Egyptians believed it could and must be restored.
Yet even this delicate separation of forces, this careful balancing of sky and earth, moisture and dryness, was not the only way the Egyptians imagined the beginning of all things, for across the long ribbon of the Nile, different cities guarded different doors into the same mystery of creation, each with its own favored gods, its own sacred language of origin. Egyptian mythology, as we embark on this exploration of its many starting points, reveals itself as a complex tapestry rather than a single straight line. In Memphis, the great city of craftsmen and builders, the priest spoke of a creator who did not rise from the waters as a shining body, but who first existed as pure mind. This was Ptah, patron of artisans and architects, who shaped the cosmic order as a master builder shapes stone, yet whose true tools were not chisel and mallet, but thought and speech. In the so-called Memphite theology, preserved on the Shabaka stone, we are told that Ptah conceived all things in his heart and brought them into being with his tongue, an image that feels strikingly abstract, almost philosophical, as if the entire world were a spoken ritual, a recitation of names that called mountains, temples, and even other gods into a living reality. Far to the south, in Thebes, another vision slowly rose to prominence, especially as that city became the political heart of the Egyptian civilization. Here, the hidden god Amun, whose very name suggests what is concealed and unknowable, was praised as the one who existed before all, the invisible wind that moves but cannot be seen. As Thebes gained power, its theology expanded, and Amun was joined with the radiant sun god to form Amun-Ra, a composite deity who was at once the secret depth behind the cosmos and the visible disk that crossed the sky each day. In this Theban tradition, creation is both mysterious and manifest, a reminder that the divine may be simultaneously beyond all form and intimately present in light, heat, and breath. Still other cities offered still other beginnings. At Hermopolis, priests spoke of the Octoad, 8 primordial gods and goddesses in male-female pairs, embodying darkness, hiddenness, endless water, and the formlessness before shape. From their interplay emerged a cosmic egg or first mound from which the sun god appeared, another way of imagining that first break in the waters of noon. These parallel accounts did not compete in the way we might expect. Across 3 millennia, what remained constant was a willingness to let multiple symbols stand side by side, each illuminating a different facet of the same unfathomable source. For the Egyptians, these were not contradictions to be solved, but different windows onto fundamental human concerns about origin, meaning, and destiny, different ritual languages for approaching the same sacred reality. Memphis emphasized mind and word, Thebes emphasized the hidden and the manifest, Hermopolis emphasized the swirling chaos that precedes order, and all of them together created a mythology that continues to captivate us with its profound wisdom. Yet, among all these beginnings, one cluster of gods would come to dominate the emotional landscape of Egyptian beliefs, not only explaining how the world was made, but how it could be broken and remade. In the next part of our journey, we turn to Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Horus, a divine family whose story of murder, mourning, and restoration would shape Egyptian ideas of death, justice, and the afterlife for countless generations.
And so, from the vast sweep of creation myths and solar journeys, we descend into something more intimate and immediately human, a kingdom, a family, a single throne. Along the life-giving banks of the Nile, where golden sands meet fertile black soil, Egyptian mythology imagines a time when the land was still half wild, when fields lay uncultivated, and human communities had not yet learned how to live in lasting order. Into this early landscape comes Osiris, not as a distant abstraction, but as a king who walks among his people. He is a culture bringer, a civilizing power in human form, teaching agriculture so that grain might rise in neat rows instead of scattered patches, establishing law so that disputes are settled by measured judgment rather than by blood, and instructing in proper worship so that the gods are honored through fitting ritual rather than fearful guesswork. Egyptian beliefs present him as the first great ruler of the two lands, a model for every pharaoh who would later claim to uphold Ma'at, that delicate balance of truth, justice, and cosmic order. At his side stands Isis, his sister and wife, whose presence completes the image of ideal rule. Where Osiris embodies just kingship, Isis embodies devoted intelligence, protective love, and the subtle arts of magic. She knows the hidden names of gods, understands the secret workings of the body and the soul, and will later prove that knowledge and tenderness can be as powerful as armies. Together they form a kind of divine prototype for the royal couple, he governing the visible structures of civilization, she guarding the unseen currents of fate and healing that flow beneath. Yet no ordered realm exists without a boundary, and at that boundary stands their brother Set. He is strong, necessary, and deeply unsettling. Associated with the red desert rather than the green floodplain, with violent storms rather than the predictable rise of the Nile, with foreign lands and strange customs rather than the familiar rhythms of Egyptian life, Set personifies the disruptive forces that press against every stable system. As Osiris's fame spreads and songs of his wise rule travel across 3 millennia of retelling, Set's restlessness grows into a sharper emotion, envy, and then resentment. In this contrast between Osiris and Set, we can sense more than a quarrel among gods. We find a complex tapestry of ideas about stability and disruption, harvest and drought, trusted neighbor and threatening outsider, even the calm parts of our own character and the impulses that seek to overturn them. Egyptian mythology continues to captivate us because it treats these fundamental human concerns not as simple opposites, but as elements in a living reality that must constantly be negotiated. As we embark on this exploration of the Osiris cycle, we should keep in mind that what remained constant was the belief that even the most golden rain is fragile. In the quiet spaces of the palace, behind ceremonies and hymns of praise, Set is already watching, already calculating, already shaping a cunning plan. The good king has brought order to the land, but in the shadows of that order, change is gathering, and Osiris's serene rule will not endure unchanged for long.
And so, in the hush after praise songs and processions, we find ourselves in the dim corridors of the palace where lamps burn low and whispered plans take shape, and the serene face of Osiris does not yet reflect the storm that is about to break. Egyptian mythology often moves from bright public ritual into shadowed intrigue, and here the god of fertile kingship will learn how fragile even the most harmonious order can be. Seth's jealousy does not erupt as a sudden outburst, it crystallizes as a design as we embark on this exploration of betrayal that continues to captivate us precisely because it feels so deliberate. He commissions a chest, sometimes called a coffin, crafted with exquisite care, measured to the exact length and breadth of Osiris's body, adorned with fine inlays and gleaming surfaces so that it appears less a trap than a royal gift. At a banquet, with wine flowing and music soft, Seth invites the guests to admire this marvel, promising to bestow it upon whoever fits it perfectly. One by one, the gods recline within the chest, laughing as they find it too long or too short, until Osiris, unsuspecting and gracious, agrees to try. He lies down, and the lid closes over him with the quiet finality of a decision already made. In an instant, the mood shifts. Seth and his accomplices leap forward, sealing the chest with nails and molten lead, transforming a beautiful object into a prison, and the hall of celebration into a place of suffocation and silence. They carry the sealed chest to the Nile and cast it into the current, and the river that had been a symbol of life, fertility, and cosmic order becomes for a time a corridor of loss. We are invited to imagine the coffin drifting past reeds and villages, past fields that Osiris himself had blessed, while the world above continues unaware. The god who guaranteed the renewal of crops now floats as a lifeless burden, and the Egyptian imagination registers this not merely as a death, but as a wound in the very fabric of civilization. In some tellings, the story darkens further. Seth later recovers the body and, fearing any possibility of restoration, cuts Osiris into many pieces, scattering them across the land. In marshes and deserts, in towns and sacred sites, the fragments of the king lie hidden. The dismemberment carries heavy symbolism. The king and the land that mirrored him are torn apart. Unity becomes dispersion, and what remained constant was suddenly called into question by this brutal fragmentation. Here mythology speaks to fundamental human concerns about what happens when coherence fails, when a body, a kingdom, or a life is no longer whole. Across 3 millennia of Egyptian beliefs, this moment marked a descent into mourning and instability that demanded response, ritual, and remembrance. The cosmos itself seems to pause, waiting to see whether order will simply dissolve into the primordial waters of none once more. Yet even as we linger with the image of scattered limbs and a drifting coffin, the story is already turning toward healing. Somewhere, Isis feels the absence of her husband as a sharp, unignorable emptiness, and her love will not accept that the pieces of Osiris remain forever apart. In the next movement of this complex tapestry, we will follow her patient, magical search as devotion, ritual, and profound wisdom attempt to gather the scattered fragments of order back into a living reality.
And so, in the quiet that follows catastrophe, we find Isis beginning her search, stepping out into a landscape that feels wounded,
as though the very Nile banks and desert winds remember the violence done to Osiris. Along the life-giving river, through marshes heavy with reeds and the calls of hidden birds, she wanders as a grieving wife and a determined magician, following whispers of rumor and traces of divine presence, refusing to accept that her husband's body remains scattered and forgotten. Egyptian mythology presents this not as a single, swift recovery, but as a long, patient gathering, a complex tapestry of small acts of devotion. In some tellings, Nephthys, who had once been complicit in Seth's plot, joins Isis in remorse and solidarity, helping her search riverbanks, fields, and remote shrines for the lost pieces of Osiris. At the edges of burial grounds where jackals prowl and the boundary between village and necropolis blurs, the jackal-headed Anubis appears as a silent guardian, guiding them toward fragments of the broken king. Piece by piece, Osiris is recovered, a limb found near a village jetty, a bone unearthed from silt, a sacred relic guarded by a local shrine. Each discovery is accompanied by ritual, by laments that are themselves spells, by careful washing, anointing, and wrapping. As we embark on this exploration of Isis's work, we see that for the Egyptian imagination, grief is never only emotion, it is also technique, a disciplined practice that uses sound, gesture, and secret words to restore cosmic order. What remained constant was the conviction that correct ritual could knit together what chaos had torn apart. When, at last, the body of Osiris is reassembled, Anubis takes a central role. As god of embalming, he supervises the bandaging, the resins, the linen that turns a vulnerable corpse into something deliberately preserved. In this moment, Osiris becomes, in mythic terms, the first mummy, the prototype for all later funerary practice across 3 millennia of Egyptian civilization. The priests who would one day embalm artisans, nobles, and pharaohs are understood to be repeating Anubis's careful work on Osiris himself. Yet the goal is not merely preservation, but a brief, astonishing reanimation. Through spells, through the rhythmic beating of hands and the piercing cries of lament, Isis coaxes life back into Osiris, just enough for a miraculous union. From this union she conceives Horus, the falcon child who will grow to challenge Seth and restore royal order, embodying the profound wisdom that life can arise even in the shadow of death. Osiris does not return to rule among the living. Instead, he descends to the Duat, the mysterious underworld, where he becomes lord of the dead and guarantor of their renewal. There he will preside in judgment, receiving the justified as companions, a living reality in the realm beyond. Already the pattern of the afterlife is set. To die is to be dismembered by time, and to hope is to be reassembled through ritual. From that quiet hall of judgment where Osiris waits among balanced scales and careful feathers, we are drawn back in time to a more fragile scene, to reeds whispering in the Nile Delta, and a small hidden shrine of mud and woven rushes where Isis shelters with her infant son. Along the life-giving marshes, far from the formal temples of Egyptian civilization, the future of kingship lies in a cradle of papyrus. Here the mythology becomes intimate. Isis, who could reassemble a murdered god, must now protect a vulnerable child from the relentless hostility of Seth, who roams the land as usurper, seeking to extinguish the rightful heir before he can grow. We are told she hides Horus among the islands of the north, living as a refugee, muttering spells over him as scorpions and snakes creep through the reeds. And when venom overcomes the boy and his breath falters, she cries out to the assembled gods for help. It is Thoth, the ibis-headed lord of writing and wise speech, who answers, standing in the marsh like a priest-physician, reciting healing words that draw poison backward and restore the child to life. In this small domestic crisis, we glimpse profound wisdom about vulnerability and care. Even a future king depends on others. Even a divine mother must sometimes call for aid. As the child grows, the story widens into one of the great epics of Egyptian mythology, known to us as the Contendings of Horus and Seth, a long and sometimes playfully ironic saga in which the gods convene as a cosmic court. Here the question is simple to state, yet endlessly complex to resolve. Should the throne belong to the son of Osiris or to the powerful Seth, who already holds it? Across 3 millennia, this dilemma of inheritance and strength versus legitimacy and memory continues to captivate us. We watch as hearings are held in the presence of Ra, as different gods argue like dignified advocates, some favoring the stability Seth promises, others insisting that royal blood and proper succession must prevail. The debate spills beyond words into ritualized struggle. Horus and Seth transform into hippopotami and fight underwater for days. In another episode, Horus loses an eye in violent conflict, while Seth is mutilated and loses a testicle, the mythology marking their bodies as records of cosmic dispute. When Thoth restores the torn-out eye of Horus, he does more than heal an injury. The reassembled, perfected eye becomes the Wedjat, the sound eye, its fractions and curves encoding completeness, its image repeated endlessly as an amulet of protection, wholeness, and restored order. What remained constant was the belief that this symbolic eye could knit together what had been broken in the body, in the state, and in the soul. At last, after long argument, trickery, and transformation, the divine court recognizes Horus as the rightful king. Yet Seth is not simply erased. He is redefined, given roles at the edge of the cosmos, a necessary force against chaos rather than a sovereign at the center. From this resolution emerges a lasting theological pattern. Each reigning pharaoh is Horus on earth, the living embodiment of that legal victory, while the dead king becomes Osiris, joining the afterlife court we have already glimpsed. In this way, the myth becomes a living reality, every coronation and burial reenacting the triumph of rightful order, and preparing us to follow the sun god himself through the duat, where these same principles of justice and balance will be tested in the journeys of ordinary souls.
From that royal courtroom of Horus and Osiris, our attention is gently drawn upward to the blazing disk that governed not only kingship, but the rhythm of every breath in Egyptian civilization. Along the clear arc of the sky, the sun god Ra travels in his shining bark, a golden vessel imagined gliding upon a celestial river, illuminating fields and cities, temples and tombs, and sustaining life with a steady outpouring of light and heat. In this solar boat, Ra is rarely alone. Egyptian mythology fills the deck with attendant gods who steer, protect, and announce his passage, so that what we might see as a simple sunrise becomes, in their beliefs, a carefully choreographed ritual of cosmic maintenance. Sia,
the personification of perception, and who, authoritative speech, stand near him, while divine helmsmen guide the prow, and protective deities line the sides like a living shield. The scene is vivid and concrete. Farmers looking up from the black soil of the Nile floodplain could imagine that somewhere above, this radiant procession was moving in parallel with their own daily labor. Yet, as we embark on this exploration of Ra's voyage, we find that the Egyptians did not picture the sun as an unchanging mechanical light, but as a living reality, subject to time, strain, and even decline. As the day advances, Ra is said to age. His strength at its peak in the brilliant noon slowly wanes toward evening, his rays lengthening and softening, his brilliance becoming fragile. This daily aging offered a gentle but insistent reminder that all created things, even gods in their manifest forms, are bound into cycles of vigor and exhaustion, of expenditure and renewal. When the sun sinks toward the western horizon, Egyptian texts describe a moment of transition that is both serene and ominous. The glowing bark approaches the Akhet, the horizon, conceived as a luminous gateway where sky and earth meet, and then, almost imperceptibly, the boat seems to tip downward, entering the unseen. To the eye, this is simple sunset. Within the complex tapestry of their mythology, it is Ra's descent into the Duat, the underworld, where a new and perilous journey begins in darkness. In the night boat, different companions gather, and the tone shifts from public radiance to secret trial. Here Maat herself, the goddess of truth, balance, and right order, stands or sits upon the vessel, a small, composed figure whose feather will later weigh human hearts, yet whose presence already signifies that even the sun's movement is not automatic, but an ongoing act of choosing and upholding order against encroaching chaos. What remained constant was the conviction that without Maat on board, the river of night would swallow the light forever. Across 3 millennia, priests and scribes elaborated detailed maps of this nocturnal voyage, carving on tomb walls the caverns, gates, and guardians Ra must pass, and hinting at a profound wisdom that even the greatest powers must traverse vulnerability and risk. In these shadowed regions, a vast serpent coils and waits, the embodiment of unmaking, whose confrontation with the sun god continues to captivate us. We will follow Ra into that encounter where each new dawn depends on a battle that can never finally be won, only fought again. So we follow the sun god downward, away from the bright arc of the day, into the hidden landscape beneath the western horizon, where the Egyptians imagined a vast and intricate realm unfolding in darkness. Along the life-giving banks of the Nile, night might appear simple, just shadow and cool air, but in their mythology, beneath that darkness stretched the Duat, a complex tapestry of caverns, corridors, and shimmering fields, a living reality as structured as the world above. The Duat was not a single cavern, but a layered underworld, lying both beneath the earth and beyond the sunset, threaded with rivers and lakes of fire, bordered by deserts of sand and water, divided by walls and gates that only the properly equipped could pass. Each gate had its name, each doorway its guardian, each region its strange inhabitants, serpent-necked beings, lion-headed deities, and silent, watchful figures holding knives or scepters, all participating in the maintenance of cosmic order. As we embark on this exploration of Ra's night journey, we are entering a geography that was mapped with almost bureaucratic precision on tomb walls and papyrus scrolls. According to texts like the Amduat and the Book of Gates, Ra's solar bark passes through 12 great regions corresponding to the 12 hours of the night, each hour a distinct zone with its own hazards and helpers. Time itself becomes space. In the first hours, the boat descends into darkness, greeted by gods who tow it with ropes, by blessed dead who have earned the right to accompany the sun, and by protective deities who speak spells to open doors and neutralize dangers. Later hours lead through chambers where enemies of order are bound and punished, where mummiform gods stand in rows, and where the souls of the justified receive offerings illuminated only by the glow of the sun god's hidden light. Yet in this carefully ordered realm, chaos is never far away. Coiled in the depths of the Duat waits Apophis or Apep, an immense serpent of primordial darkness whose very body is an assault on creation. In some scenes he rises from the waters to halt the boat, in others he attempts to swallow the bark whole, or to ensnare it in coils that extinguish light and sound, embodying the terrifying possibility that dawn might simply fail to arrive. This is not a single decisive battle, but a perpetual confrontation renewed every night across 3 millennia of Egyptian belief. On the prow of the bark defenders stand, for even Ra cannot face this alone. Here, in a striking reversal, Seth, so often the disruptive brother in the Osiris cycle, becomes champion of the sun, spear in hand, hurling bolts and weapons into the serpent's flanks. What remained constant was the conviction that powers of apparent disorder could, in the right ritual context, be turned toward the preservation of order, and that the gods themselves cooperated in this fragile balance. In the deepest hours, Ra is shown uniting with Osiris, the lord of the dead, a moment when the aging sun and the resurrected king fuse into a single hidden power. From this union, the bark emerges into the final hours, the sun god rejuvenated, ready to rise once more at the eastern horizon. Each sunrise, then, was not routine, but triumph, a daily reassurance that light would return, that the afterlife remained accessible, and that the cosmic struggle continued to captivate us, even as the next phase of Egyptian mythology unfolds before us. From that triumphant sunrise when Ra emerges renewed from the Duat, Egyptian mythology turns our attention to a different kind of light and a different kind of danger. For not all radiance is gentle, and not all divine power is content to remain close at hand. Along the life-giving banks of the Nile, people knew that the same sun which warmed the fields could scorch them, and they imagined this ambivalent force as the Eye of Ra, a blazing feminine presence who could shield the world or burn it. In some versions, humans grow arrogant, plotting rebellion against the aged sun god, and Ra responds not with thunder, but with an emissary of his own wrath, sending his eye down among them in leonine form. She appears as a lioness goddess, often identified with Sekhmet or a fierce aspect of Hathor, her claws and breath like the desert wind, her eyes twin suns. Egyptian beliefs describe her as a living reality of divine anger, and as we embark on this exploration of her story, we begin to see how closely the Egyptians linked cosmic order with the fragile balance of emotion itself. Yet the myth does something unexpected. Instead of a simple tale of punishment, the eye's fury becomes too great even for Ra to bear. She is intoxicated with bloodlust, or in some tellings she feels betrayed and misunderstood, and so she leaves, striding away from Egypt into a distant foreign desert, still a lioness, still ablaze, but now far from the Black Land. Her departure is not merely symbolic, it is as though a piece of the sun has been torn from the sky. The land grows dry, the Nile seems hesitant, and the people feel an invisible chill, not of temperature, but of spiritual dryness and disordered hearts. In this absence, the other gods act. Thoth, master of measured words and lunar calm, or sometimes Shu, the clear air that separates sky from earth, travels to this far-off land. They do not chain the goddess or overpower her. Instead, they speak, they sing, they offer cool beer tinted red like blood, a gentle pattern interrupt in a story of rage and exile. Through music, through laughter, through drink that soothes the burning heart, they invite her to remember joy, to soften from lioness to cow, from Sekhmet to Hathor, from destroyer to giver of delight. Her return is not quiet. Myths and temple ritual describe festivals where people drank in her honor, played music through the night, and welcomed the moment when the dangerous heat of the year gave way to the promise of the inundation. The eye's homecoming could be linked to the rising of the Nile, to fertility returning to the fields, to the reweaving of the complex tapestry of Ma'at after a season of fear. Across 3 millennia, what remained constant was this intuition that even divine anger could be transformed, that withdrawal could prepare the way for a deeper, more conscious reunion. In this cycle of anger, exile, and joyful return, we recognize fundamental human concerns. We know what it is to burn too hot, to step away, to feel distant from our own sources of warmth, and we know the strange relief of reconciliation when what once threatened to consume us returns as a calmer, more benevolent force. The Egyptians encoded this profound wisdom in a lioness who goes away and a gentle goddess who comes back, in festivals of drunkenness that masked a serious truth, that even the sun must learn to temper itself, and that absence can make the return of light feel newly sacred. As we move forward, other myths will show us different transformations, yet this story of the distant goddess continues to captivate us, inviting us to trust that even in spiritual drought, the waters are already on their way.
From the story of the distant goddess returning with her cooled, life-giving waters, we turn inward to another kind of return. For the Egyptians believed that when a person died, many parts of the self had to find their way back into harmony. Along the life-giving banks of the Nile, where tomb chapels opened toward the sunrise, identity itself was treated as a sacred, fragile construction, a complex tapestry of visible and invisible elements that had to be cared for with as much attention as the body. As we embark on this exploration of the Egyptian understanding of the person, we begin with the Ka, the vital life force, often imagined as a kind of spiritual double that was born with you and remained close, like a silent twin. In life, the Ka was sustained through food, drink, and breath, but death did not end its hunger. It changed the form of that need. This is why tombs were furnished with offering tables, carved loaves of bread, painted jars of beer and wine, and inscriptions promising 1,000 of every good and pure thing, so that priests and descendants could feed the ka through spoken formulae and ritual, turning nourishment into living reality. Complementing the ka was the ba, the mobile, expressive aspect of the person, often depicted in Egyptian art as a human-headed bird with outstretched wings. At night, the ba could leave the tomb, visiting familiar places, drifting through courtyards and along the riverbank, or traveling with the gods between the worlds of the living and the dead. Funerary texts describe the ba emerging at dawn to see the sun god rise, then returning at evening to rejoin the body. For only when body, ka, and ba were properly reunited could a person become an ach, an effective, transfigured spirit in the afterlife. Yet these were not the only components that mattered. The ren, the name, was considered a core part of identity, so essential that to erase a name from stone was to wound the person across eternity. As long as your name was written, remembered, and spoken aloud, you endured. Even the shadow, the shoot, was more than a mere absence of light. It was another subtle aspect of being, following a person in life and lingering near the tomb, a reminder that every presence casts a trace, every existence leaves an outline on the world. At the center of this constellation stood the ib, the heart. Unlike later traditions that elevated the brain, Egyptian beliefs located thought, memory, desire, and morality in the heart, which would one day be weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the great judgment of the dead. Because of this, the heart was left inside the mummified body, while amulets and spells begged it not to testify against its owner. Across 3 millennia, details of the afterlife shifted, yet what remained constant was this conviction. The self was not a single simple entity, but a gathering of parts that had to be protected, preserved, and gently reintegrated through mythology, ritual, and story. As we move deeper into the duat, we will see how each of these elements is tested, guided, and, if all goes well, welcomed into eternal company with Osiris and the sun god.
From that gathering of subtle parts, we step with you to the river's edge, where the visible landscape of death quietly mirrors the invisible journey beyond, and the Egyptian imagination turns geography itself into theology. Along the western bank of the Nile, where the sun sinks each evening in bands of rose and gold, the desert rises in soft, pale cliffs, and here, in this calm, dry light, the land of the living gives way to the land of the dead. For the Egyptians, this west was not merely a direction, but a promise that as the sun god Ra descended, so too would the deceased follow him, entering the duat with the same cosmic regularity that governed dawn and dusk. Pyramids on the plateau, mastabas with their flat bench-like roofs, and rock-cut tombs hollowed into the cliffs were oriented with deliberate care, aligned to the north stars that never set, or to the precise point where the sun touched the horizon, so that architecture, astronomy, and mythology formed a single complex tapestry of stone and light. Within this landscape, the body itself was prepared with equal deliberation, not as a morbid fixation, but a gentle, almost tender ritual of continuity.
The corpse was carefully dried, its moisture drawed away until it could endure the ages, then wrapped in layer after layer of linen, each bandage smoothed and tucked so that the human form remained recognizable. Between these linen folds, priests placed small amulets in specific positions, the scarab over the heart, the jed pillar along the spine, the eye of Horus near wounds, to anchor protection in matter, while the outer coffins, sometimes nested several deep, bore painted gods, spells, and scenes that transformed simple wood into a portable cosmos. The tomb that received this perfected body was conceived as a house for eternity, a continuation of the domestic world rather than its negation. Deep within lay the burial chamber, cool and dark, where the sarcophagus rested amid jars, furniture, and food, while nearer the surface a chapel opened to the living world, its walls carved with scenes of feasting, farming, and family gatherings. Here relatives and priests could enter, speak the name of the deceased, pour water, offer bread and beer, and recite prayers so that the ka might be nourished, the ba might be welcomed, and the boundary between worlds remained permeable, a living reality rather than a closed door. In this setting, the dead person was not simply gone. He or she became an Osiris, a participant in the god's own story of death and restoration that continues to captivate us across 3 millennia. From the sealed chamber, the ba was expected to rise, bird-like, from the tomb at dawn, rejoining the ka, reading and hearing the spells painted on walls or written on papyrus, the so-called Book of the Dead, that taught it the names of gates, the words of power, and the correct responses to guardians. What remained constant was the conviction that with proper ritual and profound wisdom encoded in these texts, the soul could navigate the duat's shifting passages. Yet this was only preparation, the poised breath before movement. Beyond the tomb door lay regions of darkness and flame, fields and rivers, serpents and stars, and a series of gates and trials in which every deed and every thought would be weighed against the feather of Maat. As we embark on this exploration of the next stage, we will follow that journey step by step until we arrive at the silent hall where a single heart is placed on the scales and everything is decided.
And so, after the winding roads of darkness and fire, after gates guarded by serpents and lakes of silent water, we arrive with the dead at the place the Egyptians called the Hall of Two Truths, a vast, still chamber where judgment itself becomes a kind of sacred ritual. Here, the mythology becomes almost architectural. Polished floor, towering columns, and at the far end, on a high dais, Osiris enthroned as ruler of the afterlife, flanked by Isis and Nephthys like living hieroglyphs of protection and mourning. Around them stands a complex tapestry of divine figures, each embodying some aspect of law, memory, or cosmic order, for this is not a private moment, but a public, ceremonial weighing before the gods and before the universe. Anubis, jackal-headed guardian of the dead, leads the newly arrived soul forward with measured steps, his black fur a symbol of fertile soil and regeneration, while Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of wisdom, waits nearby with palette and reed pen, ready to record the outcome with meticulous care. At the center of the hall stands the great balance, a pair of scales whose simplicity conceals profound wisdom. On one pan, Anubis places the heart of the deceased, preserved in the body, because Egyptians believed it to be the seat of thought, memory, and intention. On the other, he sets the single white feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, and right order. The image is almost disarmingly clear. Every action, every secret motive, every unspoken desire is gathered into that heart, and it must not outweigh the feather that represents the very pattern of the cosmos. Nearby crouches a figure whose presence continues to captivate us, Amit, the devourer, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, a composite of the most dangerous creatures of the Nile world. She does not torture, she does not preside over fiery pits, she simply waits. If the heart proves heavier than the feather, if it tips the scales away from Ma'at, she consumes it in a single irrevocable act, and the person simply ceases to be, denied the continuing living reality of the afterlife. Before the weighing, however, there is speech. The dead recite what modern scholars call the negative confession or declaration of innocence, addressing 42 assessors of Ma'at. I have not stolen, I have not murdered, I have not polluted the waters, I have not diminished the offerings to the gods. This is not boastfulness, but alignment, an attempt to show that one's life participated in Ma'at rather than in Isfet, the chaos that always threatened Egyptian civilization across 3 millennia. As we embark on this exploration of judgment, we might gently imagine our own hearts on such scales, not as a threat, but a quiet invitation to consider balance, honesty, and the weight of our choices. For the Egyptians, what remained constant was the hope that a light, truthful heart would pass this test, allowing the soul to move beyond the hall of decision toward the green, sunlit fields that await on the other side of justice, where our journey will soon continue.
From the hall of judgment, we follow the justified heart into a different kind of silence, one filled not with anxiety, but with wind in tall reeds and the soft splash of oars. Beyond the scales of Ma'at, Egyptian mythology opens into a landscape of reward, the field of reeds, Sekhet Aru, a perfected echo of the Nile Valley, where the anxieties of survival fall away, and only its beauty and abundance remain. Along calm canals that never fail to flood in due season, we see fields of grain already high and golden, palm groves heavy with dates, and irrigation dikes that never crack or crumble. The air is clear, the light gentle, and the breeze moves through the reeds with the same slow rhythm as the breath of a sleeping river. Here, in this idealized Egypt, the righteous dead live in houses they recognize, walk on familiar soil, and continue the patterns of work and rest that shaped their earthly days, but without hunger, exhaustion, or fear. Life continues, yet it is quietly perfected. In this afterlife, work itself becomes a kind of joy, a ritual participation in cosmic order rather than a burden of necessity. The deceased may plow, sow, and harvest, but the tasks are light, and they are not alone. Around them stand small figurines, shapti, carved in stone or faience and inscribed with spells. In the tomb they were motionless objects. In Sekhet Aru they awaken as helpers, ready to answer when the gods call the owner to labor. With a single command, the Shaktis step forward to perform the heavier tasks, so that the blessed soul can choose when to work and when to rest in the shade, watching the eternal Nile flow by. Yet this green realm is not only agricultural, it is also cosmic. The justified dead are invited into the great cycles that govern the universe, no longer as anxious observers, but as honored companions. Some join the solar bark of Ra, sailing with the sun god across the sky by day and through the duat by night, helping to repel the serpent of chaos and to ensure that dawn will come again. Others dwell in the retinue of Osiris, seated in his lush, shadowed court, sharing in the god's calm authority over the dead and participating in the ongoing renewal that his resurrection symbolizes. As we embark on this exploration of the Egyptian afterlife, we also encounter alternative destinies that continue to captivate us. A soul might become an Akh, an effective, luminous being, shining as an imperishable star in the night sky, or it might merge more closely with a particular deity, taking on the qualities of Ra, Osiris, or Hathor, while still retaining its name and memories. Across 3 millennia, the details of these images shifted, yet what remained constant was the assurance that identity was not erased, but transfigured. All of these visions, taken together, form a complex tapestry of hope, in which death is never a simple ending. For this ancient civilization, aligned with Maat through right living, proper ritual, and a profound wisdom encoded in funerary texts, death marked a transition into a more stable, luminous existence, where the fragile blessings of earthly life were preserved and made secure. In the next part of our journey, we will draw closer to Osiris himself, and to the myths that explain how a murdered king became the gentle ruler of these green fields and the guardian of every future dawn. From those green fields of the west, where Osiris presides over a perfected landscape, we can gently step back and look at the larger pattern that surrounds him, a pattern of time itself, flowing and folding like the Nile in flood and retreat. Egyptian mythology, for all its vivid stories of gods and kings, was also a meditation on how moments pass, return, and yet somehow endure beyond change. Across this civilization, priests and scribes spoke of 2 intertwined modes of time, which together formed a complex tapestry of existence. One was called Nehe, the time of cycles, of sunrise and sunset, of the waxing and waning moon, of the annual inundation when the dark waters of Nun seemed to rise again through the Nile. The other was Jet, the time of endurance, the unchanging completion of things, the stillness of a finished monument or a perfected afterlife. As we embark on this exploration of sacred time, we find that the myths live in both dimensions at once. In Nehe, the sun god sails his bark across the sky each day, grows old in the evening, and is reborn from the eastern horizon at dawn. In Jet, his first emergence from the primordial mound at creation is an accomplished fact, never to be undone. In Nehe, the Nile floods each year, renewing the fields and echoing the first surge of waters that parted to reveal land. In Jet, that initial act of creation remains the eternal model of fertility and order. In Nehe, each new pharaoh takes the throne as Horus, repeating the victory of Horus over Set. In Jet, the rightful kingship established after the murder and resurrection of Osiris stands forever as a cosmic verdict. Ritual was the bridge between these layers of time, a living reality in which past, present, and eternity met. When priests recited the creation hymns at dawn, they were not merely remembering an event long ago, they were assisting the sun in rising, reenacting the first day so that this day might exist at all. When festivals for Osiris unfolded with mourning, searching, and joyful discovery, the participants were not simply actors in a pageant, but companions of Isis, helping to reassemble the god, and thus guaranteeing the stability of the afterlife and the kingdom. Underlying this vision was a conviction that memory sustains being. Names carved on tomb walls, stories retold in temple courts, offerings brought to ancestral graves, all kept the dead from a second, more terrible death, the fading of their name into silence. Even the gods relied on remembrance. To speak the names of Ra, Osiris, or Ma'at was to affirm their presence and uphold cosmic order. Forgetting, by contrast, was a kind of unraveling, a quiet return to the indistinct waters of Nun. Yet this concern with memory continues to captivate us because it speaks to fundamental human concerns about how we endure beyond our brief span of years. As we listen now, across 3 millennia, to the voices of this ancient mythology, we ourselves become links in the chain of remembrance, allowing these beliefs, these rituals, this profound wisdom about time and renewal to breathe again. What remained constant was the hope that as long as the stories were told, the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, and the path to Osiris's fields would remain open. In the next stage of our journey, we will follow that rising sun more closely, descending with it into the Duat to witness the nightly struggle that makes each new dawn possible. And yet, as the sun we have been following rises and sets across centuries, the world around these stories begins to change, and we find ourselves in a long twilight rather than a sudden night, watching Egyptian mythology adjust its colors to new horizons, even as its old constellations remain faintly visible. Along the same Nile banks, beneath the same wide sky, the temples are still there, but the rulers and languages of power have new names. Under the Ptolemies, when Greek kings sat on the throne of the pharaohs, the great sanctuaries did not fall silent. They continued to function as centers of ritual, learning, and local identity, their walls still inscribed with hieroglyphs that proclaimed the king as Horus and son of Ra. In this complex tapestry of cultures, new gods appeared, or rather new combinations of the old, such as Serapis, a composite deity, blending aspects of Osiris and Apis with Zeus and Dionysus, whose cult promised healing and afterlife blessings in forms intelligible to both Greek and Egyptian worshippers. What remained constant was the conviction that divine powers could be approached through multiple names and images, and that cosmic order still flowed through temple rites. As we embark on this exploration of the later centuries, we see that even under the Roman emperors, the ancient beliefs did not simply vanish. Priests at Dendera, Edfu, and Philae still greeted the dawn, performed daily offerings, and reenacted creation in carefully prescribed ritual sequences. The emperors in distant Rome were carved in Egyptian style on temple walls, receiving life from the gods, even if their personal devotion lay elsewhere, and the resources that sustained these vast complexes slowly diminished. Political power shifted to governors and imperial officials, yet within the sanctuary's innermost rooms, the statues were washed, anointed, and clothed as if the world beyond the pylons had not changed. Gradually, however, another current rose along the Nile. Christianity spread through towns and villages, offering a different reading of divine history, affirming one God and reinterpreting or rejecting the older gods as demons, allegories, or noble errors of the past. Temples were closed, not all at once, but over generations. Philae, a last stronghold of Isis, maintained her cult into the 6th century of our era before its rituals ceased. With the end of the temple schools, hieroglyphs were no longer taught, and across 3 millennia of tradition, the sacred script that had once preserved every nuance of creation and afterlife belief slowly became an unreadable pattern of birds, eyes, and serpents. For centuries, the stories carved on stone stood mute to outsiders, their profound wisdom locked behind forgotten signs, inspiring travelers to weave fantasies about hidden magic and lost sciences. Then, in the 19th century, with Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphs, the voices in those walls began to speak again, and the textual tradition reopened, revealing not sorcery in the crude sense, but a subtle theology of order, renewal, and the living reality of the gods. Yet, even in the long interval of silence, Egyptian mythology did not truly die. It flowed into Coptic tales, into esoteric traditions that saw in Isis and Osiris symbols of death and rebirth, into paintings, novels, and films that continue to captivate us with images of pyramids and judgment scales, and now into the quiet act of listening to these stories at night. The names have shifted, the rituals have changed, but the fundamental human concerns remain, and the old narratives still rise like a hidden sun beneath our own. As we move forward, we will follow that hidden light into new landscapes where ancient gods and symbols reawaken in unexpected places, and where the boundary between ancient memory and modern imagination grows strangely thin. And so, as that hidden light carries us onward, we find ourselves looking back over the vast terrain we have crossed together, the complex tapestry of Egyptian mythology now stretching quietly behind your closed eyes. Along its length, we have watched the first mound rise from the silent, dark waters of Nun, seen the sun god emerge and name the world into being, and felt how from the very first moment of creation the question of order and chaos was already present. From that first act of creation, the Ennead of Heliopolis unfolded, Shu and Tefnut separating sky and earth, Geb and Nut arching away from one another so that space could open for life, and a great family of gods establishing a cosmic structure in which every force, every relationship had its place. Across 3 millennia, the names and emphases shifted, yet what remained constant was this sense that existence itself is a carefully balanced arrangement, a living reality held between opposing pressures that must never be allowed to collapse back into the undifferentiated deep. Within that ordered world, we followed the more intimate story of Osiris and his family, a divine drama that continues to captivate us because it speaks so directly to loss and repair. We watched Osiris betrayed and dismembered, Isis searching patient piece by piece along the Nile, gathering what had been scattered, and through grief and ritual and magic restoring him to a new life as lord of the afterlife. In Horus's long vindication against Seth, the slow court cases and contested wounds, we saw that justice in this mythology is rarely instantaneous. It is argued, tested, and finally affirmed so that both kingship and the fragile fabric of order can endure. We traced Ra's daily voyage, his blazing bark crossing the sky by day and slipping into the Duat at dusk, where he grew old and vulnerable, and yet each night passed through danger to be reborn at dawn. That cycle echoed in the journey of the human soul, the Ba and Ka navigating the shadowed halls, the heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the hope of standing justified beside Osiris. These narratives of death and return are not rigid doctrines, but gentle mirrors, reflecting our own experiences of endings and unexpected renewals, of chapters in our lives that seem to close forever and then, in quiet ways, open again. As we embark on this exploration of their enduring meaning, a different pattern emerges. Beneath the elaborate symbolism and intricate ritual, these myths speak to fundamental human concerns about change, grief, responsibility, and the search for significance in a world that can feel unstable. They suggest that even when things fall apart, some deeper order still holds, and that restoration, though rarely simple, remains possible. Perhaps most soothing of all is the sense that, in this Egyptian vision, the universe is not indifferent. It is populated by beings who care about balance and justice, who guard the thresholds between day and night, between life and death, who accompany souls through the dark instead of abandoning them to it. As the details of names and lineages begin to soften at the edges in your mind, you can let them go and simply rest in the feeling of having walked through a great ancient story that now lies around you like the desert at midnight, vast and quiet and strangely protective. In the sections ahead, we will let this presence grow even softer, following only faint echoes of these myths as they surface in later ages, until the gods themselves feel like distant stars, still shining, but asking nothing more of you than to drift and to dream.
And so, as the presence of these gods and stories grows softer around us, we find ourselves standing once more at the threshold between the Duat and the world above, aware that we have walked through a complex tapestry of Egyptian mythology that continues to captivate us even in this quiet, drowsy hour. Across 3 millennia of Egyptian civilization, from the first whispered hymns on temple walls to the last carved hieroglyphs, people returned again and again to these tales of creation and afterlife, of cosmic order and encroaching chaos, of fragile human lives touched by the eternal. We have seen how in the beginning there was only the dark, still water of Nun, and how from that silence a first mound arose and the sun god appeared, bringing light, warmth, and time itself into being. Around him gathered the Ennead, the family of gods whose loves and quarrels, whose griefs and restorations mirrored the fundamental human concerns of birth and loss,
justice, and renewal. What remained constant was the sense that these myths were not merely stories, but a living reality, explaining why the Nile rose, why kings ruled, why hearts were judged after death. Now, as you lie wherever you are, you might imagine that you are resting in a painted tomb chamber, cool and still, your body arranged with the same quiet care the Egyptians once offered their dead. Isis's wings curve around you like a soft, sheltering blanket, every feather a spell of protection, while Anubis, patient and watchful, keeps his eternal vigil at your side. Above you, the ceiling dissolves into the starry body of Nut, her luminous form arching overhead, and far beyond the horizon of your closed eyes, Ra prepares once more to rise, promising that even the longest night bends toward dawn. Whether you remain gently awake, hovering in that half-dreaming space, or have already slipped unnoticed into sleep, the stories have done their work, simply by passing through your awareness. Their symbolism and profound wisdom settle like fine desert dust, almost weightless, adding a subtle depth to the silence around you, so that your night is not empty, but quietly inhabited by remembered temples, slow river water, and the distant names of gods. If you wish, on another evening we can return together to these Egyptian beliefs, to follow Ra's bark again through the Duat, or to stand once more in the Hall of Two Truths as the heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. Or we might drift to other lands and other ages as we embark on this exploration of different mythologies, letting new pantheons and rituals unfold before you as gently as tonight's journey. There is no urgency, no demand, only an open doorway into the world's ancient imaginations whenever you feel called to step through. For now, we will let the words grow slower and the spaces between them grow wider, like breath taken in a dark, quiet temple before the first light reaches the floor. May your rest be balanced, your inner sky clear, your heart as light as a feather. Like the sun god sinking beneath the western horizon, you too can allow yourself to let go into the darkness, trusting that when you next awaken, you too will have been quietly renewed.